I want to welcome you. I mean, you have such an amazing career, all of the things that you've done, all of your releases. And you just did a release with Gravitas, Future Self, which was great, and had remixes from Zebler and Conti and Dissolve, and and then Suhan, who's your good buddy. And I just thought, it would be great to have you. And we're starting this new office hours, which I thought was kind of an interesting take on like the education thing, and just bringing people, giving us an opportunity to have people ask questions, listen to their music. I wanted you to dive in and talk about your process. We got all of everybody's questions that they submitted. Thanks for being here, and let's get started.
Cool. Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. We've been working together for some time now, and different facets from, Pivotal to Gravitas. And, it's been really great working with you, and I really appreciate it. And you guys have such a great, solid crew. And it's really nice to, have a label on your back, that really is solid and they know what they're doing. So thank you so much for all you do and for bringing me in. Definitely appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And I want to thank all the participants. Thank you guys for being here as well. And I, checked out the questions and some of the tracks, and there was some really, really, great questions in there. Some were similar, some were very different, but I kind of have an idea of, different angles and different ways to talk about, my production and kind of what I do. And as a bonus, I decided that I'm going to randomly pick someone who sent in a question, and I'm going to give them one of these. This is a USB drive necklace that has a crystal on it, and the crystal is charged as I'm working on music in the studio. And it's a necklace that you wear, and it has all my music and videos on it. I sell these for like $50, but I'm going to randomly select someone who sent in a question. I'll email you, and I'll mail it to you. So be looking in your email for this. And I think also we'll be sending an email just of some links and some things that I'll be talking about, just to follow up with you guys, so you don't have to dig around and search for it. It'll be right there.
Totally. And we put up a new sample pack that you did from your release. We'll be sharing that with people, and we're recording this, so we'll share that with everyone as well.
Yeah, I'm really stoked. Today, the sample pack for Future Self came out, and it has samples from my songs and also the remixes from Zebler Conti, who's like an amazing coach in his own right. He worked at Berkeley Music. I mean, he's amazing. And Suhan, who does this crazy sample music based, that he does. And then the up and comers Dissolve, which are awesome. So I'm really excited about that. And then, as you mentioned earlier, we've launched this coaching with myself. So I now do one-on-one Zoom coaching, since I've got, quite a bit of downtime, and I want to share my knowledge with you guys. So if you're interested, we'll send you a link to that. And I've also opened up mastering and mixing as well, and that's on my website. So if you need mastering or mixing, hit me up. Ableton Coaching, sample pack. So it's lots of great stuff that I've got to offer now, and I'm really, really thankful to share it with you guys. So so this is kind of like the kickoff of all of those things. So right now is a very interesting time. As you know, some of you guys have lots of time to work on music, which is great. You've got unemployment, so you're getting paid, and you're just kicking back, working on music. And so it's a really exciting time for those people. There's other people like myself where I have a daughter and she's not in school. So my time is a little bit more limited, but, I'm still able to work a lot at home and really dive into the music. Some people, are excited about what's coming up. Some people have anxiety. We don't know how this is all going to unfold, but I think being creative and really diving in, can really help kind of escape everything. I mean, that's the beauty about music, is like you can really escape and just kind of get away from everything. Put your headphones on, crank your sub and your speakers up, and just just go, and then you just like forget about everything. And that's the beauty of music. So as I mentioned earlier, I checked out some of your questions, and I've kind of narrowed down different ideas and different things to show you guys how my process is. And I'm going to talk about what I called music production mindset. Then I'll talk about a little bit of my hardware that I use, structure in music production, and plugins. I'll try and just touch on, all of that. There's, we have an hour, and I'll try and get to as much as I can. But those are some of the questions that came up, and I'll try and go through all those. So first I want to talk about is music production mindset. So I've seen a lot of tutorials. I've worked with a lot of my friends. And what I'd like to do is kind of talk about things that other people aren't talking about. I'm not going to talk about like, oh, use OTT and everything, and oh, use Serum or whatever. It's like I want to talk about things that people aren't really talking about. There's certain plugins that I use and certain things that I do that other people don't do that I think will be very valuable for you. So I'm not going to just waste your time talking about the same old stuff that everyone else talks about. So, okay, the first thing, it's called music production mindset. And music production mindset is what I do before I start working on music. I used to just like jump in cold and work on music, but then I would kind of get stuck and I would kind of get lost and just it just wasn't flowing. So this is something that helps me to get into the flow state. So this is just what I do. You don't have to do it. You can maybe take some ideas, but I'm just going to tell you my process. So before I work on music, the first thing I do is holotropic breath work. So holotropic breath work is something that's become very popular lately. There's a person named Wim Hof, there's Dr. Graf, there's other people that have talked about this, and it's become quite popular. And what it is basically this pranic breath work that was developed, thousands of years ago by, Indians and used with yoga and Buddhist monks. So it has come here to the West, and it's something that people are using. And it basically, through the breath work, it gets your blood flowing. It, invigorates your mind and your body. And for me, that really helps. Next step, what I do is I meditate. I meditate for about 15 or 20 minutes. And in that meditation, I basically align the body and spirit. And so the breath work gets your blood flowing, gets the body energized. And then with meditation, spiritually, it will help you to become more creative and kind of connect with, source or a higher power, or, just relax yourself before you go into the studio. Because sometimes people have anxiety going to the studio, but this will help calm you and get you into a state where you're actually more productive. There's different types of meditation. There's mindfulness meditation, transcendental. Myself, I use Kundalini meditation, and I can suggest some, or you could. I'm sure there's friends that know about meditation. There might be, a teacher online that you might connect with, but meditation for me is really key. Third part is visualization. Now, this is really, really important, because basically after you go from meditation, you go into visualization. So you basically visualize yourself in the studio working on music. And whatever you want to accomplish that day, you visualize what you want to happen. So let's say you want to start a new song. So you visualize yourself in the studio, making a beat, rocking the bass line, have a killer melody, and, at the end of the day, you've got a really great song, So it could be that. Or let's say you have a song where you've got the beat and you've got a bass line, but, this melody is just not coming to you. So you visualize working on that song, and then maybe through visualization, that melody will appear. And then straight out of visualization, you go to the studio and you work on music. And for me, doing that just makes me way more productive. I don't drink caffeine, and I don't drink, any sort of, like Alpha Brain or any of those things, nootropics. I just basically use natural methods to kind of get me into the flow state. And for me, that's what helps. And it becomes more sustaining throughout the day. And so what I'll do is, work on music for 2 hours, and then I'll take a break, have a snack, maybe do a little bit of exercise, maybe a little more breath work, and then do another 2 hours, and then, continue that. So that's kind of my flow state and getting into the mindset of production. So that's the first part. So the next thing I want to jump into is hardware tips. Okay. I'm going to show you some things that I don't know why no one else uses it, but I talk to a lot of producers and I've watched a lot of videos and no one talks about this. And for me, it's really key. It's a game changer. I've been using it for years and I want to talk to you guys about it. Okay. The first thing is a mouse. Now you're thinking, okay, yeah, it's just a mouse, whatever. It's a Logitech mouse. With this mouse, it's great because it has hyper scrolling. So I can, with a flick of my finger, I can go from track 1 to 0 in like half a second. 1 to 100 in half a second. So when you have a lot of tracks, my tracks are usually between 70 to 100. So if I want to get from my vocals, which is usually, at the very top, to my sub and kick, which is at the bottom, with hyperscoring, I can get there very quickly. Also, this has 6 buttons where you can map them to quick keys. So basically, a lot of my quick keys, my copy, paste, Control Z, etc., all those quick keys are on this mouse. Then on my other hand, I have this. It's called a Shuttle Express. I think you can see that. And we'll have links to these as well. So this has 5 buttons, and it has a scrub wheel, and it also has a jog wheel. So years ago, it's at my friend's house, and he edits movie trailers. And he was using one of these, and he wasn't touching his keyboard at all. He was like in the matrix, just like in the flow, just rocking. And I was like, wow, that's really cool. And I said, I wish they had one of those for music. And he said, well, I think it works for music. You can work for anything. You just program the buttons. I was like, okay, cool. So I bought one and it worked great. So this has 9 programmable buttons that you can map to quick keys, and this has 6. So together there's 15 quick keys. So when I'm working on music, I'm basically not touching my keyboard at all. I'm basically hyper-focused, laser-focused on the screen and just rocking. I never have to touch my keyboard. Basically, everything is at my fingertips. And since with my muscle memory, exactly where everything is. It takes a little while to get used to, but that way I can just be cooking, just like rocking. And one thing I really hated was I would look at my screen working on music, and then I'd look down to my keyboard, copy, paste, and I just look up and down, up and down. I was getting whiplash by the end of the night. Like, I need a massage. Okay, maybe not really. But anyway, you get the idea. It's like, once you take your eyes off the screen, you might think of something else. Hey, what am I going to have for dinner? Oh, you know what? I'm going to go and, see on Yelp what I can eat tonight, what I'm going to have for delivery. And then you've gone down a rabbit hole, and then 30 minutes later, you're like, oh man, what did I just do? I could have been working on music. So anyway, for me, that has really helped. Those are 2 hardware things that I've talked about. The next thing.
David, sorry to interrupt. They're asking what the device was called again, the round device.
It's called, if you can see it, it's Contour, and it's called the Shuttle Express with an X. Shuttle Express.
Cool.
It's backwards, but I think you can kind of see what it is. So anyways, I'll have a link to that so you guys can check it out. But it's weird. It's like, out of all the YouTube videos and all the producers I know, no one uses that. Everyone's using, a regular mouse, and they're using their keyboard, and it just seems kind of insane to me that, they're not using that. So another couple hardware things. Hold on.
Yeah, just to jump in on that. I mean, if you watch videos with Mr. Bill, and you can hear how much Mr. Bill relies on his keyboard shortcuts to edit. I mean, obviously that's kind of one of the cruxes of his style, is all the thousands of micro edits and things that he does. But I think you have a great point of all of that ties back into just staying in your creative flow,
Right.
not losing focus, not getting sidetracked, not getting pulled into other things or other thoughts. So, those two segments that you just hit on, it all seems to be about honing your focus, sharpening your focus, and then once you have your focus, staying in the focus.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, 15 quick keys, I mean, that's quite a few, that's most of them. There's a couple more that I, wish I had, but, 15 is about, what I use anyway. So, okay, next hardware. Now, I'm sure all of you guys know about this guy, Subpack. So for monitoring, it's really key for your sub levels. I think everyone should have a subwoofer for sure. One that you can turn on and off. That is really key. You need to be able to hear your tops by themselves. And then you also need to have a subwoofer where you can turn it on and off. And there are multiple reasons for that I could, go into. But basically, just logically, if you think about it, you want your tops to hear, the top end. And when you press the button, button to disengage the sub, what happens is that your tops go full range again. It turns off the crossover, so that you could hear the sub on where it's crossovered, and you can hear the sub with the sub range, or you can turn it off and you just hear the full range in the tops. So that's important, but it's also important to have Subpack. And the reason for Subpack is because, unless you have a room that's completely dialed in, the way air moves and the way sub frequencies are, there's always going to be problems. It's never going to be perfect. So I try and have as many references as possible. And Subpack is a really great reference for me because, especially at late night, past 9 o'clock, it's hard for me to crank up a sub. So with a 6-year-old, it's really difficult. So this has been really key for me for a long time. I've known the guys in the company. I, work with them on projects and things like that. And I think they're really solid. And if you don't have one, I would check them out. We'll send you a link, so that you can, check out the Subpack and see what you think for yourself. I think there's a money back guarantee, the first 30 days. So you can try it. If you don't like it, you just send it back. They've got a warranty and everything. So Subpack is really crucial for working on your low end. Last hardware tip, planar headphones. I love traditional headphones where they've got speakers, but this the headphone technology is new for planars, but planar speakers have been around forever. Basically, it's a membrane with coils floating in between two magnets. So it's a different type of technology. And because of that, the clarity of the headphones, there's just zero distortion, and the lows and the highs are, a much lower and higher frequency than any other traditional headphones. I mean, they're amazing. When planars first came out, they were, in the thousands. Odyssey was a company that became very well known for theirs. I have the LCD2 Classics, and they're great. And they've all come down in price. Those are about $700. These were $500 about 3 years ago when I got them, but you can find refurbished ones for about $150 or used ones for $150. These are the Hi-Fi Man 400Is, and I'll send you a link to that. There's also another company called Monoprice. Monoprice makes really great stuff at really low prices, from guitar amps to headphones to cables. So if you're looking for something that's pretty good quality, that's inexpensive, Monoprice is, a really good go-to for a lot of things. So planar headphones. Okay, so those are the things, hardware stuff that I use that keeps me in the flow state that I think are crucial for me to use because it just helps me with the end result, which is to have a really clean mix. And, the better reference, the better way you can reference, overall is what you want. You want, headphones that have a lot of clarity. You want speakers that are decent quality. And you also want to reference on lots of different, ways. So when I reference, I always use earbuds. I use 2 sets of studio speakers. I use my car. I use 2 different types of headphones, planers and DJ headphones, and also Mac speakers and my phone, because people listen to your music on all those devices. So basically I check everything, and you'd be surprised. You're like, wow, that snare is like way super loud, and it's a good way to kind of check. So you just make notes as you're referencing on all those different speakers and headphones, and then you go back to your studio and make adjustments. And so what I do is I kind of balance it in between everything. The kick is always going to be really big, but as far as the high end, which, you hear mostly with phones and with computer speakers, make sure to balance that out so that it comes in nice and clear, and so that certain things aren't too loud. Okay. Next, I want to get into structure and arrangement and song ideas. So there were quite a few questions that came in about this. And they asked, what about, how do I arrange a track? I start working on music and I just don't know where to start. Structure and arrangement has been a problem for a lot of guys, and there's a little, I guess, trick, you could say, where what I do is I suggest to my students that why don't you check the tracks that you like that are in a specific genre and look at the arrangement that they have. All arrangements are very similar, from pop music to country music to rock music to EDM. It's like verse, chorus, intro, breakdown, drop, bridge, intro, build up, drop, verse, build up, drop. Every genre has its sort of arrangement. So what I suggest is basically pick like your favorite 5 or 10 songs, check out the arrangement, and then map it. So moving on, I'm going to share my screen and kind of show you what I'm talking about. So here are, this particular track that I was working on. It's a track called Osho from my Future Self EP on Gravitas Recordings. And, it's kind of in the trap genre. It's my own thing. It's like psychedelic trap, you could say. But, I went to Beatport, and, there was a few tracks that I really liked that were really cool. There's Peekaboo track, this Tynan track, Eliminate, I love their stuff, love his stuff. It's really cool. So basically it's like, okay, all of the structure and the arrangement is somewhat similar. You've got the beginning, and then you've got the build up, and then you've got the drop, and then you've got the build up and the drop and the breakdown. It's similar. So what I would do is basically map out, the structure that they have that's going on, that's happening in your genre, and then start from there. It's like, okay, well, I know I need like an intro, so go ahead and you basically write an intro. And then, next you need a build up. So you write up a build up, and the next a drop. Like, the drop needs to go there. So the arrangement and structure basically is very similar for whatever genre you're producing. So what I would do is, check what other people are doing. It also might give you some sound ideas as well. Some people basically, when they're first starting off, they do sound like tracks, and that's one way how to produce, they're like, okay, there's this Peekaboo song, and they try and replicate it. And by doing that, you're actually learning things. So that's one way how to kind of learn structure and kind of sound design and certain things, trying to figure out how people do that. On YouTube, there's, lots of people that have tutorials. It's like, oh yeah, I basically did a sound alike of whatever track. So I think that can be helpful. Don't get in that trap where, you just stay there. You basically, you've gone through, whatever, you've been doing sound-alikes of Skrillex's tracks. And then next thing you know, you're just, all your tracks and all your originals sound like Skrillex, and then you're just a Skrillex wannabe. Well, I think that's really important, is having your own sound. And at the beginning, you may not have your own sound because you're not sure maybe what direction you want to go to, or maybe you have some ideas, but you don't know how to get there yet because your production level isn't there. but it's really important. Glitch Mob, they have their sound. They're basically their own genre. Tipper is Tipper. He's his own genre. Sure, it's within EDM or electronica, electronic music, whatever, but it is, he has his own sound. Same with Closey. Closey had her own sound. She kind of merged it with future bass, and so she was able to cross over. Same with Bassnectar. He had his sound that was his own. He had a great following. He basically merged that into dubstep, and it crossed over to a wider audience. All of those artists, they have their own sound, myself included. It's like people are like, "Oh, who do you sound like?" Whatever. It's like, well, I sound like David Starfire. And people, when they hear my music, they like, "Oh, that's David." Same with Tipper and Bassnectar. Sure, there are people that are sound alikes, but those people are not going to be innovators. They're not going to be the ones that are going to last. They're not the ones that are going to be around in a year or two. You have to own your own sound, and you have to, be yourself. And that's really important. Make music because you really love the music that you're making and you want to do something different. If you're just making music because you want to be the next Skrillex or because you want to get a bunch of chicks or whatever, or dudes, then you're doing it for the wrong reasons. If you want to do it for a hobby, that is completely fine. But I think a lot of you here, want to do it, professionally and are serious about it, and just really look at where you're at and what you want to do. And your personality has to come out, and you have to do it for real. You can't fake it. People will know. They know vibrations. If you're just faking it and you're just up there, it's not going to happen. So you need to be true, you need to be real, and you just come from your heart.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. I mean, as when we listen to demos for Gravitas, that's one of the big boxes I want to check. There's this weird thing between you want music to be relatable and people to sort of like know somewhere where it's coming from, but at the same time, we very much want to hear what you have to say. I want to be taken somewhere. I want to be transported. I want to be really I want the music to do something, say something. So I can't stress this enough. And I think that's one of the most challenging things to do. That's the hard work. And I think, David, you hit a good point of, use these reference tracks, learn by studying other people's music, emulate. And that's what everybody does when they're starting off. But eventually you got to jump off and blaze your own trail. I think the example of the Glitch Mob is a fantastic. They were kind of lumped into this glitch sound, and they, on every album, they're sort of expanding and doing new things. And so, they're also three people, and they're sort of the amalgamation of three different people's musical influences, all that, which is pretty interesting. So, it's sort of like, absolutely take your influences, take the stuff that inspires you, digest it through you, and then put it out into your own art. There's nothing wrong with having a relation to other artists, but you need to be authentic. You need to come from a true place. If you are copying another artist, you're sort of already at the back of the line, so to speak. So do you, and really, I think you can maybe speak a little bit more to that, David. Was there a point where like you sort of could see that coming for yourself, where you turned that corner, and maybe what did that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting for me because how my whole career started, I was in bands for a long time, and I was doing electronic music, and I had a roommate in San Francisco, and he worked at Amoeba Music, and he worked in the world music section, and he would come home with these CDs at the time, and he would play me this really crazy music, from just all over, from Africa and from Israel, and I was astonished by just how amazing this music was. And so I would just make kind of like mashups, I would basically sample the CD and have beats and just kind of throw it together. And I was just kind of doing it for fun. At that time I was in a band, and we were playing in San Francisco, and we were kind of popular. And I was just like, hey, this is cool and fun and different, and I gave it to my DJ friends, and like, wow, this is like really cool stuff. And then they started playing it out, and then it just kind of caught on from there. And it was just something that I loved doing. I thought was really interesting, but it wasn't like, hey, I want to be, this famous DJ or whatever. It was like, it came from my heart. I thought it was something that it was important to get this music out there, and it would be great to have it on the dance floor, So that's kind of, how I started. But it was all because, it wasn't like, hey, I want to be super famous. It was like, this is something I really loved doing and I really believed in. Cool. And it just kind of took off. So
cool.
Next, I'd like to jump into the production part. I'm sure everyone's like, all right, quit the yapping. We want to see some, some cool plugins and see what you really do. So, all right, we're getting into that point. But first, really something really important I want to talk about. I've been talking about this for years to producers and my students, and this is the number one thing. People always ask, how do you get your mixes so clean? My mixes are muddy, my subs, kicks, how do you, separate everything? It's like, everything just sounds muddy. Okay. The first thing that you need to understand is frequencies. Okay. So let's say this is a frequency spectrum, right? You've got hi-hats. Let's say it's a rock band. You've got hi-hats, you've got vocals, your toms, your snare, your bass, and then your kick drum, right? So it fills the whole spectrum. So your ear wants to hear that spectrum, and everything has its own place in the frequency spectrum, right? So at the rock band, you have very few things, but they all have their space that cuts through, right? So when you mix it, it all pokes through easily through the frequency spectrum. Now you've got Ableton where, my songs are like 100 tracks, right? So there's like so many things going on, so many layers upon layers. And so, sometimes less is more, but sometimes you like to have a song that has a ton of crazy sounds. And you can do that because you've got Ableton and there's endless tracks. One thing that you have to realize is that all the frequencies need to cut through. So if you have too many things layered on top of each other, things are going to be muddy. So one thing you need to do is you need to alleviate frequency masking. Frequency masking is when you have too many frequencies on top of each other. If you do, it's going to be muddy. You need to have frequencies that are separated that cut through. So there's different ways of doing this. First thing is make sure everything is in tune. You have your kicks in tune, your snares, your toms, everything. Your kick and your snare are two of the most important instruments that you use in dance music, and no one is tuning them. Some people are now, but I started tuning my drums like 10 years ago. I worked in a studio with this, very popular band that came in the studio, and the guy was setting up the drums, and each song he would tune the drums to the key of the song. And I was like, wow, that's really amazing. And then when it came down to mix the song, it would just cut through and everything was in tune. And, so this is called what I call harmonious music production, making sure everything is tuned, including all the drums. And that alone will be the first part to help things to be a cleaner mix and sound better. Let's say you have a kick drum in F and the song's in F sharp, right? It's going to be very dissonant sounding. Let's say you have a snare that's a G and the song's in F. It's going to be very dissonant sounding. So tuning your drums is really important. There's ways to do that. Ableton has a tuner. Mixed in Key now has this Mixed in Key Studio where it's a VST in your DAW. I think it came out like last week. I haven't used it yet, but I've heard it's brilliant. That's another way to tune things. But even Foley sounds, doesn't matter what you have. Anything that you have needs to be in the key and the scale of the song. So that's the first thing that's really important. The second thing is to make sure that things aren't overlapping. Now, on the high end of the spectrum, you can get away with things kind of overlapping. But once you get into the mids, the lower mids, and especially in the sub-frequency, you need to have things separated where they kind of poke through. Okay, so number one, move the notes around to where they're not fighting and competing against each other. Number two, what you can do is certain EQ tricks. You can have mono with one sound, and you can use mid-side or, split it in half to where it's left-right. So then you can have two sounds that are like in the same frequency, but they're in the different parts of the stereo field, so they're able to cut through. An example of this is in rock bands. You've a vocalist and you've got guitars, right? But they're in the same frequency and they clash. So what they do is they have the vocals straight through the middle and they have the guitars hard pan left and right. And so everything has its space. So you kind of have to think about that and use that kind of theory with all of your sounds. And so when everything has its own frequency in the stereo field, what happens is it is able to cut through. So when it comes down to mixing and mastering, everything is cutting through, and so mixing is almost done for you. The problems happen with muddiness when you have too many frequencies that are on top of each other. So there's a plugin that I use, an analyzer called the Multi-Analyzer with Melder Productions, which I don't know why no one else uses it. I never see them in any videos, but it's something that I've been using for a long time, and it can really help with those things and see where the frequencies are, see where the conflicts are, and helping to clean up your mix. All right. I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit of this song. This is Osho, and it features my friend Jeff Stott on oud and my good friend Ganga Giri, didgeridoo master from Australia. Very excited to have them on this track, and it's off of Future Self on Gravitas. We'll just go to the drop because that has, most things. Okay, so here's the multi-analyzer, and how it works is basically you have an instance of this on groups or tracks, and then basically you have the same colors assigned to the colors on the waveform of the analyzer. What I like to do is I like to be very organized. So my vocals are always purple, my melodies like didgeridoo, orange, so on. Percussion is always brown, subs are blue, snares are green, red is my kick. So I can just kind of scroll down and see exactly, okay, there's my sub, there's my kick. Anyways, those same colors correspond with the colors here. I know it's going to the oud, that's the wrong color. But anyways, you get the idea. So there's my vocal, strings, percussion, snare. So I'm going to go ahead and play this track a little bit, and you'll kind of see all the different parts that are being played. So as you can see, there's the kick. As you look, you'll see the kick and the sub. So the kick is poking through. It has its place in the frequency spectrum. You've got the sub. You've got different things. Now, in the higher frequency spectrum, there are going to be some things that are overlapping, but mainly you want to look in the mid and the low section. So to me, this plugin is a game changer because you can see exactly where the conflicts are. And I'll kind of go through some of the other things that you can do with this plug. So there's collisions, I should say, sonogram, you can use oscilloscope. So I'll kind of play with it a little bit as I'm going through this section of the song. With this plugin, you can really see the collisions, and for me, that is just a game changer, And then you can go in and deal with those certain areas that are overlapping. So that is very, very important to use. I don't know why no one else uses that. So okay, that's one tip right there, and that is really, really important. Next thing I'd like to talk about is Sidechain. And this is another game changer. Some people may know about this, some people don't. I never really liked the Sidechain with Ableton. It ducks and it works okay, but it wasn't very clean. So I've been using Volume Shaper, and Volume Shaper is just a cleaner way because it's a gate. It basically cuts the sound out. So I'll show you what I mean. The way I have things set up, by the way, is I have different groups. So my vocals are in a group, synths are in a group, strings are in a group, my oud and didgeridoo are separated, got FX in a group. So I have everything grouped. Okay, and each individual track will have, compression, saturator, EQ, etc. So each track will have its processing, and then on the group together to glue it, I'll have even more processing as a group. So I've got here OTT. Sometimes I'll have the glue compressor, another EQ, maybe mid-side, and I'll have analyzers as well. So I think that's really important for gain staging, basically to compress every track just a little bit, just have a little bit of compression on each track and then have a little bit of glue compression on the groups. And so what you're doing is you're raising, you're compressing it. And so it's giving it more bite and more presence, but I'm not squashing it. If you want to sound like Datsik, basically you can just, put OTTs on every track and every group and, put it on your mastering track if that's the sound you want. I'm looking for more dynamics. I have a lot of organic elements in my track. And so I want it to be, to breathe more and have more dynamics. And I do that by just compressing a little bit on each track, and then on the groups, compressing it a little bit as well. And then, of course, mastering, compression, and limiting. So, okay, going back to Sidechain. So I have my Sidechain set up here. I've got one for the kick and then one for the snare. And what I really like about Volume Shaper is that not only is it great at gating whatever section you want to gate, it also does it within a frequency range. So the problem I had with most side chains is it basically just side chains the entire instrument, the entire sound. When with the kick drum, it's like, let's say you've got a vocal, right? Well, if you sidechain the vocal with kick drum, basically you're cutting out the vocal sound, but the vocal really isn't conflicting with the kick drum. So this way, I have only, the frequency from 230 hertz on down is being sidechained. And for the snare, I have from 179 hertz to 9,000 hertz sidechained. So I have a certain spectrum of the frequency that I could sidechain. And I think that's really important. For me, I want it to be more organic, and I want certain instruments to breathe and cut through. When you sidechain using either Gatekeeper or using the sidechain in Ableton, it cuts out the entire sound when it doesn't need to, if there's not a conflict. So again, you want to alleviate conflicts, but if there's no conflicts, you want it to cut through. So what I did is I basically have the kick and the snare sidechaining on almost all of the instruments, which is here. The vocal, synth, strings, didgeridoo, oud, FX group. I have all those basically under one rack that has the kick and has the snare sidechain. So, and because they have their frequencies that they're sidechaining, that it still allows the other instruments to come through that don't have conflicts. Now for the percussion, basically I need it to cut through all the way. So the percussion group, I have it set up a little differently, where I have the low is definitely cut out with certain spectrum, but then I believe the highs, I I'll have the entire spectrum, or a bigger spectrum of frequency. So I want all the highs to be sidechain. So the great thing is certain instruments, you can set this up exactly how you want, certain groups. And so that's how I have it. So that I think is really important, because before, when I would sidechain things, you could hear the sidechain cutting in and out to instruments that they didn't need to cut out. So what's next? So that's really important. One thing I'd like to talk about before we get into some of the questions and listen to a couple tracks is one thing that's really important is using something to reference tracks with. I use this. There's a couple different things I use. There's Magic AB by Sample Magic. They actually don't make it anymore, but you can still find it certain places. And what this does is you put this at the end of your mastering rack, and you basically can A/B whatever song you're trying to match it with. And this is really helpful because you're listening to a song and you're like, wow, this song sounds great. The mix is awesome, right? And then you go play it out and you're like, wow, that sounds horrible. So as you're mixing the song, you really need to be referencing another song. So usually it's a song in the same tempo and the same key. That's really important, because if they're in a different key, a different tempo, it's going to be off. Because let's say you have a song and your song is in E, the reference song is in G, that is much higher. So when you're talking about the subfrequency in the G is going to sound louder than the subfrequency in the E, because the subfrequency in G is higher and it cuts through, so it'll be perceived as louder. So that's really important. So I'll just kind of show you how this works. There's also another plugin called Reference, Mastering the Mix. That's really good too. Sometimes I use that. And then Melda Productions, they also have one called M Compare. I haven't used it yet, but I have a couple of friends that use it and they like it. So, I use this or Reference and it works really good. So I'll show you kind of how it works. So the idea is you can basically A/B back and forth, and you can compare it, very quickly. I know a lot of people, they'll use tracks. This is how I used to do it, where I'd have tracks and would listen to it back and forth, but you'd have the problem of turning your mastering on and off. This way you have it at the end of your chain, and the tracks themselves, they're mastered, but they are not using the mastering that's on your master bus. But you can hear the mastering on your master bus going into the Magic AB, So it's great for referencing. It's really, really important. So I use other people's tracks. I use my own tracks. That is a very key plugin that I use, either using Magic AB, Reference, or Compare. Now, just to let you guys know, this is not my normal mastering rack. A lot of people ask me about mastering. I could do 2 hours just on mastering. But this is similar to how I have it set up with, I'll first start off with a compressor that kind of grabs the peaks. I'll have some EQs, a multiband dynamics, and I'll have a limiter. I'll have a few other things as well. Each track is different. So I'm just using Ableton plugs because the mastering plugs, they take up a lot of CPU. And between streaming and a track that has 70 tracks, I don't want my computer to crash. I have a great computer, but it can only take so much. So I just use the Ableton mastering plugs just for this. But normally I use, a lot of FabFilter and Waves plugins. So there you go. So I hope there were some helpful tips there with mastering and gain staging, EQing, tuning, etc. And I hope that you got a lot out of it. And I think at this point, we're about ready to move on to maybe a couple of questions and listen to a couple of tracks. But for those of you that just started joining, didn't catch the beginning, today I launched a sample pack from my Future Self EP that has samples from myself, Suhan, Zebulon Conti, and Dissolve. We'll send you a link to that. It's like $5 or free. It's donation based, 117 sounds and 5 racks. And I've also started doing coaching. So if you want some Ableton training directly one-on-one from me on Zoom, I'll send you a link to that as well. Or you can go to the Gravitas Create website under coaching and you can find me there. I'm also now doing mastering and mixing for people. So if you're interested in any sort of mastering and mixing, you can go to my website and find me there. So I really appreciate all of you here. At this point, I think maybe we'll check out a couple of questions. Jesse, I haven't been going through the feed because I've been talking about production.
Oh, man, that was amazing. Thank you for all that. I think the reference tracks, that seemed like really helpful information. And then what you were doing with the selective EQing, that seems really important. I think that it's like the more fine tune you can get with your EQing, the more you can let your sounds really live in their harmonic spaces. So yeah, thank you for that. Great info. We did record it. We are, we'll have notes. You dropped a bunch of great info. Some of the questions we got were, I think, some quick ones. Are you still using Gatekeeper?
Not really. I was using Gatekeeper for a while, and sometimes I will use it, but I switched over mainly to Volume Shaper just because you can pick the frequency area that you want to sidechain, and to me that's key. It's a game changer.
Cool.
But sometimes if I just want that sidechain effect where it's just super clean and just cutting it out, let's say I'm doing future bass and I just want that as an effect, I'll use Gatekeeper.
Right on.
Because it's just easier.
This is an interesting question. I hear this one a lot, and I think it's I'm sure there's a wide range of answers, but how long do you generally spend on a track?
That's
the $1 million question.
That's okay. How I work is, I kind of talked about how I work in like 2-hour segments. So I work on a song for 2 hours, then work on another song for 2 hours, work on another song for 2 hours. So I'll be working on like 5 to 7 songs at a time. So because I work that way, I mean, after 2 hours of listening to the same song, I go crazy. I know some people, they'll just work on the same song all day for like a week or several weeks and then finish the song. And I think that's a great way to do it. For me, like I work on a song for 2 hours and move on to the next song. The end result is by the end of a month, I'll have those songs done, but it'll take a while, because I'm only working on them 2 hours a day, but I've got, a finished EP by the end of it versus like, the same amount of time. Let's say you work on a song for realistically, I would say about at least a week, really. It takes, even if you kind of get into the meat of the song within the first day or two, getting really to the finer points, of detailing it and really making it super clean and punchy takes a while. And then referencing on all different speakers takes a little bit. And then I always play it out. I play it out. Sometimes I'll play it out. I'm like, dude, this song is going to fucking kill. And then I play it out. And then like this one section, is just like the breakdown's way too long. I'm like, okay, well, I need to change that. You always want to experiment on the dance floor and kind of maybe not like, your Coachella gig, but, a smaller gig, experiment with your tracks and kind of see what people think and what flows and then go back and change it. I mean, almost every song, when I think it's finished, I'll play it out and then I'll go back and I'll make changes to the arrangement and also to the song. Great.
Yeah, I'm looking through all the questions that we got. You really talked about your workflow. You talked about your compression, glue compression. There's some questions about kind of your bass sound design. How do you get good low sub bass? To me, your answer was being really diligent about your EQing, letting each sound have its own space. Are there any other tips you could offer around like bass and
totally. So let's see, going to my sub, and I think a lot of people do this, but maybe they don't know this. So basically my sub, this particular sub, the frequency, I'll play it. Okay, wrong song.
Yep.
Go back to Magic AB. Eliminate's great. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Eliminate, but he's just killing it right now.
Yep.
And I've been following him for quite some time. Anyway, all right, here we go. So right here's my sub, and I have my sub isolated, right? Just from 30 to 165. So it's super isolated. Everything else basically is high cut or low cut at 165. So everything else that's below 165. So if you look here, let's see, percussion, or let's go to something else, oud, right? Go to the EQ. So, maybe the group. Basically, let's see. I know why the oud is. Go to the strings. Trying to find where the EQ. Okay, so here it's at 218, right? So everything basically has a high shelf. You cut it at 165 or below, so that the sub has its own range. So all of the tracks, everything below 165, there's anything lower than 165, it's only the sub and the kick, and that's it. And the sub and the kick are side chained heavily. So it's only the kick or the sub happening, but not at the same time. And so everything else below 165 basically is EQ'd out. And so that's how you have a clean sub and you have a clean bass. Now, if there isn't any sub or kick playing at that time, then you open it up to like 60, full range. So only when the sub and the kick are playing, let's say you have a breakdown, there's no sub or kick, then you can have the full range. But then once the sub and kick come in the drop, then you automate the EQ so that it cuts at 165. And 165 just happens to be the magic number for this track, because the sub, you basically look at where the sub is. The sub is here. And then I actually have a high sub, which I'll play. It's basically replicated. You can't really hear it, but I have also it cut at 165, and then I have distortion on it. So this helps with having low end. Let's say you're listening to, your speakers, your computer speakers or earbuds. You can't hear the low end of the bass. So this is a way using distortion and using EQ to where you have so where you can hear the bass. And it's a trick that a lot of people use, but maybe you may not know about it. But that's really so that's how you kind of deal with subfrequencies and with EQing, just kind of in general with the low registers compared to everything else.
Great. So there's definitely a lot on mixing and mastering and really staying organized. Let's kind of go back to being creative and how you get started thinking about a sound palette. There were some questions about being blocked. To me, you answered that when we were talking about your creative mindset, getting ready to go into the studio, getting that blood going. And also what I heard when I coach people when I do artist coaching, is treating it as a job and getting in there and working every single day. And segmenting your day. I'm gonna really put in the time for these blocks, and I think training yourself to do that. So aside from those two things, do you have a way that you like to get started? You go sample hunting, and then another one was, how do you organize your samples and plugins?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. I'll sit down at a computer and I'll figure out what kind of day it is, and I figure that out fairly easily. I start to work on the song, and if it's just not really flowing, the way I want it to, then what I'll do is I'll just do sound design, or I'll go sample hunting, so every day is different. Some days it'll be like 5 days in a row and I'm just like rocking it and I'm working on songs and it's flowing. Some days, just don't force it. Do other things. YouTube tutorials, I'll learn Serum, which is quite deep, sound design, sample hunting, whatever, and when you do those things, you basically are finding things for your sound that you like. You go sample hunting. So then you have a folder of all these killer samples. You spend a day working on Serum sounds. You spend a day finding the right 808 sounds, it's the right snare sounds. So then you have folders of different things that you really like. So then, there's a day that happens where you're like, okay, I'm feeling creative. You start grabbing things from those folders and placing them in the song. There might be samples from, might have a Ravi Shankar sitar and you just throw it in there. It kind of gives you an idea of a melody. And then with that melody, maybe, you'll replicate that on a keyboard and you'll use a different sound, so you have different ideas that you use, and you have these folders that you've built up of sound design and samples that you can just throw in when you're creative. So it's like, it's either a creative day where you're working on music, or you're doing other things in production that will help you when you are working on music.
I believe in cooking, they call it mise en place. Like you prepare all of your ingredients beforehand. You have everything ready. At a restaurant, they're able to cook so fast because they've got everything, kind of at arm's reach. And I've heard that tip a lot. I think if you're not feeling creative, you're not feeling inspired, then do some of this organizational work. Right. The other thing I wanted to ask is, you talked about that. Do you have a template that you like to start with every time you start a song that's got most of your stuff loaded?
I don't have a template, but I'll show you what I do. Basically here, I'll have, I've got racks that I've made. I've got let's say, I've got my drum rack, so I'll grab
kind of like what we were just saying. You've got your racks ready to go. You can load in a channel and get it up to going really quickly. And that speaks to what we were talking about earlier of being able to move quickly when an idea strikes. Say, I'm going to get this idea down and running as quickly as possible without having to set up a channel strip.
So I've got there's a thing called the 128. I don't know if you guys have heard that, but basically it's a way how to put multiple sounds in sampler and use it in a drum rack. And so these are a lot of snares that I really like. I threw them in here and I have this rack. So I just throw this rack in. So I'm like, okay, it's got the glue compressor, it's got the fab filter EQ, it's got the analyzer, it's got everything there. So I just throw it in, bam. And it's like I start rocking, same with my sub, I've got, let's say, this massive 808 rack. We grab this, put that there, and it has everything there. It's got, once it pulls up, but it has everything there. It's got the massive, has sidechain, the drum bus, subsaturator, has all of these different things. I may not use all of them, but they're there, so that I don't have to drag them in, and they're set to how I like them. Some might have certain songs that I've already created, right? So let's say, the kick from this song I have here, the sitar from Let's Go, So I was like, okay, I want a sitar sound. It's like, all right. So then I grab this and I throw it in and like, bam, and I have it already set and it's ready to rock, And this, you can do sound design from, you can have it from a song that you've already, is already done, and you have those sounds that you've used before as a starting point, or you could start fresh, But to me, it's about being efficient, and being efficient is going in and having things like dialed in as a starting point, and then you can kind of finesse with it after that.
Great. Layer your kicks. Do you go in and try to make them like a big layered kick when you're doing something like that, or you just look for a better sample, or both?
I would say overall, just making sure any samples that you have are super solid. there's so many people I know that they'll have this kick drum and then they try and EQ it and compress it to make it sound good. I'm like, dude, just like replace it with a better kick drum. There's so many killer kick drums and snares out there. And so what I do when I start working on a song, I have, like I showed you before, I'll have my MIDI snare set up to where there'll be like 50 snares or, 20 kick drums. And as I'm working on the song, as it's developing, I'll scroll through different snares and different kicks to make sure that they, cut through. And even at the very end of the song, I'm like, done. Is this really the best kick drum? And I'll scroll through them. I kind of have like 20 of my go-tos and like 30 snares are kind of my go-tos. And then, I'll have days where I just make new ones. But to your point, sometimes they'll be layered, sometimes they aren't. It depends on the song. Whenever you have house music, you need a top kick and a low kick for sure. With bass music, not as much. There's two ways you can look at it. You could have a kick that's a higher kick that's not sidechained as much in the sub, or you could have a subby kick and mixed with the sub, but then heavily sidechained so that, as the hole opens up on the sidechain for the sub, the kick is replaced, so that you always have that kind of push and pull of the kick and the sub. And that's kind of what I like, in bass music. So, but it depends on, the type of music and each song is different. And sometimes I'll have top kicks, sometimes I'll layer kicks, but, I've created a lot of kicks and when I layer them, I always make sure they're in tune and I'll stack them. One thing I didn't talk about before, but this is like a major trick is with my snares, let's say the song's in E, right? So actually, I didn't, anyways, I could go back to my screen, but I'll just let you know. So I'll have, the snare in E, and then I'll have another snare layered like a clap that's a B that's lower, and then I'll have another snare that's an E that's higher. So it's like a chord. So it's a stack. So it's in tune with the song, and it's layered in tune so there's no clashes and it cuts through. And you want to make sure that only one has a transient and the other two don't have the transients. And I'll usually use like 2 snares and 1 clap. Mm-hmm. And depends on, what sound you want more predominant, more of a clap sound or a snare sound. That's how you would figure out which transient you want and how to adjust the volumes on that. But the most important thing is that they're in key and they're not the same note. Because if you have, an E4 snare and an E4 clap on top of each other, it's not going to sound good. It may be, there's a lot of times you're like, oh, that sounds good. But then on a big system, they're going to cancel each other out and you're going to have phasing issues. So that's a little tidbit. Same with kicks. You have a high kick and a low kick. You've got the song's in F. So you have a low F for the kick, and then the top kick, you want a high F. So it's an octave, and then you stack them on top of each other like a chord. If one is, let's say in E4 or no, E2, and then the other one is like, let's say an F2, it's going to be very dissonant. So you're going to make sure that everything is tuned and they're either octaves or fifths from each other when it comes to stacking drums.
Great. That's helpful. I hadn't actually heard that before. Well, cool, man. I think we're at the end of our time here. I want to thank everybody for signing up and coming. And David, thank you so much for your wisdom and sharing so much. I mean, that seemed like a massive amount of tricks and things that you've learned over the years. If we didn't get to your questions, sorry. We got a lot, and we'll be doing this again. So, stay tuned, and we'll be following up with everybody, and we're going to follow up with an email with the recording and some notes. And we appreciate you all. Any last words, David?
Thanks a lot. I appreciate you having me. This has been really fun. It's really cool. And I'm really happy to share, some tips and secrets. I wanted to share things that I hadn't seen, other people using and things that you hadn't seen in tutorials. So I really hope that there was something helpful that you can use and some nuggets you can take away. So again, thanks a lot. We'll be sending you more information via email, and really appreciate you guys being here, and be healthy and be safe.
All right. Thanks, guys. Have a great night. Talk to you soon.